All right, this works. Okay, so the stuff we wanted to discuss this week is how do we go about configuring clustered caches? Um, what's what lives where, and how does that happen? Um, yeah, and so we had discussed that we may want to split all configuration aspects four ways, i.e., whether they're mutable or non mutable, and whether they are clustered or not clustered. And we were thinking about splitting that as a type system. Some of that former aspect already happened because we have a config that's used to create something that's immutable, entirely immutable, and then you get a runtime config out of there that you can then use to mutate whatever is mutable, because it only exposes setters for what is mutable. Right. So Abhilash, you solved it all.
So what I was thinking, like, let's have a. So I have a API of clustered cache manager, which will map to a client side of the entity, and that clustered cache manager will have APIs. Some of the APIs, so we can have two kinds of clients. One uh, with an access, like for TMC or some kind of user setup tool, which can actually have access and can take maintenance, exclusive lock over the entity, and then do lifecycle operations like create and destroy, because all those things, for at least at the cluster level, are uh, one-time operations, fine, or very rare operations. Like, it's not like that even every now and then a cache or a cache manager would be going into a maintenance mode and doing create and destroy. And it should be an informed decision at the user level. So only some of the clients should be able to take that maintenance mode, and other clients just go and use that configured cache. They just have that cache identifier reference, cache identifier ID, and they just ask that cache manager to use that reference, which is actually sitting at the server. If it's null, just that means that it's not there. But if it's there, they'll get that reference, and then the normal operations can go on. And the other clients, when they want to do an exclusive create and destroy, they need to take a lock. So that is actually exclusive, and whenever they do it, it makes a mandatory requirement for that all other clients, normal clients which are doing or having a reference to that entity, release all the references. Makes sense?
All right. So I must say I'm totally puzzled because you totally didn't take that where I thought you would take it. So I have no idea. Maybe Louis knows, but I have no idea where you were trying to take this now. What you just covered is stuff around lifecycle,
Yeah.
which isn't entirely off, but I'm very confused about things. Is it only me or?
I don't know. I missed all of most of
Yeah,
that. So
you were late, so you were not.
I don't count. I'll shut up.
Right. So Louis, now you save this because I don't know what to say.
I think the mix-up here is between what's the configuration and how the configuration gets applied. And so we could probably start with the what. But I know from discussion, so Abhilash on his side started to look at how we could try things out and make stuff work. And so the question he has for the moment is not so much about what to configure, but how to configure it. Am I correct in stating that, Abhilash?
Yeah, how to configure and how actually the lifecycle will happen, like how a client differentiates.
So, and I think the the way Alex wanted this conversation to go was more about what we would need to configure, and try to think in the context of Ehcache 3, what makes sense to say, oh, this is clearly a cluster side configuration, and no, this is more a client-side configuration, and potentially, oh, but that client-side configuration may have some validation attached to it that are cluster-wide, or yeah.
Yeah. So one.
And so I think it was more on the what rather than on the how. Alex, does
Okay.
that sound fair to you both, Alex and Abhilash?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so you remember, the way we configure the thing which I showed to you, Alex and Louis. Fine. So Alex, you had a problem that where to configure the size of clustered cache, right? Fine. So from a user
So
perspective,
Right.
just so that we get the same understanding, you showed some prototype.
Right. Can you
code?
Can you share that?
yeah.
Do you still have it? Because otherwise,
Yeah.
I guess it's what? It's by adding a cluster
Yeah.
method on the resource pools.
Exactly. Just
And
like we have
in
other
that you probably specified both the size and the
consistency.
consistency. Okay.
Yeah. If you see this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
It's small, but let me make you presenting to everyone. You're now the presenter. Let me move you around so that it's bigger for me. Right.
yeah. So
Okay.
so my thinking was that the way user will configure a clustered tier. So all that matters to a user when it's configuring a cache is that it's just adding a cluster tier to it, rather than using off heap or anything else. Right. So if we have added a cluster tier, like a user will provide the size for the off heap or for the disk store for any authoritative tier, it's uh, provides the size for the clustered as well.
Right, but this breaks the type system thing we were talking about on the Monday or whatever it was, Tuesday.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let me explain why also maybe we're wanting to doing this. The problem is if you do it this way, you get to replicating this clustered method call on anybody that creates this cache. I understand it's creating it, like in your cluster, right? So you're calling
Yeah.
for a racy situation.
Yeah.
But when that's the case, what do you do when something isn't the way that you expect it to be? Right.
Yeah, I
So in
agree.
this
Yeah.
case, there are a couple of things going on. You're sort of defining a size for a clustered tier. This tier could already be existing, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that ties slightly back into the lifecycle stuff. But do we need to validate that those numbers are correct then? Then the other thing that you pass in as part of the same method call is what consistency the client should be in. So that's still the client-side concern. So now if I want to express something where I want to be able to say, all right, this cache is meant to be clustered, right?
Mhm.
I expect it to be clustered, or maybe that's a, what would I say, an inherent property of a cache. I don't know.
Mhm.
When calling it on a clustered cache manager. What if I don't know or care about the size? How do I express those things? But now I still need to express what consistency guarantees I want to have when accessing that clustered data.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I
does that
understand the
highlight?
problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this is, yeah, I understand. So this becomes confusing for a user, or even introduce races. So the other approach would be, that's what I was telling you. Trying to tell that we'll have a client, a specific only clients with a kind of flag with a mode, like they can take a maintenance board, and only that client client can use that API to actually do all that creation. And here I just tell, okay, fine, this is cluster, rather than doing anything else. I just mark a cache as clustered and everything, because setup tool or the setup API already does that, so that there's no confusion or no validation is required. So everything is already,
So
you remember the gray boxes.
This call that you have there is blocking until the client that's responsible for creating this thing comes around and creates it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if that
Because,
machine's dead at that point.
No, if that's the case, then there's no. Let's say, if you remember the gray boxes, if it is in an offline mode, there is no point in having a cache with a clustered tier, right?
Okay. Okay.
I think so. Here's the thing for me. I think that this highlights. I don't know. I feel like this is dipping in too deep too soon. There's really, to me, before we get into this, there are things that I want to sort out. Whether there are problems with, before we get even into configuration effectively, there are some things that I want to figure out if they're right in the persistent cache manager API at the moment, which is around controlling lifecycle transitions in persistent caches. Because I'm not convinced the stuff there is right at the moment from what I was looking at yesterday or a couple of days ago. So we know that there's two entities that need life cycling, right? And we know that their life cycles are partially independent. We know there are some things that probably get tied together, and some things that don't. I assume I should stop sharing. So we know that when you anyway, so we know that in principle the most crude thing or the most basic thing you can expose is the ability to control the lifecycle or trigger lifecycle transitions in both entities. Like create this clustered thing, destroy this clustered thing, and then create and destroy the local state. Or sorry, I shouldn't say clustered. I should say persistent and try and keep it general. And we know that one alternative to that, one slightly higher level thing than that, is to not expose the two life cycles independently, but to expose compound operations that perform that conditionally perform mixtures of operations on two, which is like things like so to borrow terminology, use existing, create, override, destroy, that kind of thing. And when I last looked at the persistent cache manager stuff, it didn't seem like there was a compelling story there. And maybe I'm misreading it, but I wonder if maybe that's a better place to start. Because if that's wrong, or we think it's not right, then talking about config and stuff and trying to use that API and then use that API as a way of driving what the config stuff looks like is kind of putting cart before the horse. Did anything that I just said make sense? Because everyone was very quiet and it freaked me out.
I think you should share your screen and be blunt
Concrete.
about what you're trying to say, because
Okay, let me try and do that. Which means I need to change project group, which means everyone has to wait for my IDE.
So
I should probably.
I guess in some way what you're saying is that what we have today in Ehcache, where on the disk we specify the size,
Yeah.
is already a bit strange.
It's a bit wrong.
Yeah.
But at least slightly wrong becomes more wrong when things become clustered.
Yeah.
Hang on, I'm just putting changes and making sure that.
Yeah, the only thing that saves us in the context of the disk is that since we're supposedly the only user, there is no complexity involved. But suddenly,
yeah. So, for example, if you say disk 1,000,000 things, right, and then you create it and you use it, and then you shut it down, and then when you start again, you say disk 500,000 things. What happens? What does it mean? Does it just ignore the 500,000? Does it override it? Does it say the max of the two? So if it was 2 million, it would grow. But like, hang on, I'm trying to get to the point where I share. I'm trying to clean up my workspace, which apparently had lots of craft sitting in. Right.
So, in the wild, clearly one of the reasons we're so hesitant in that context is that we know the way it's done in Ehcache 2x is just not an option.
Yeah.
And so we want really to improve that, but it doesn't mean we've nailed it yet. And so that's all the conversation. And for those wondering, yes, the clustering solution that Ehcache 3 will be linked to will be open source.
Actually, let's just start
although it's not out yet. The day some code makes it in Ehcache, it's going to be there.
So I guess the question for me is, how do I... So persistent cache manager, right, which is supposed to be the interface that handles all this stuff, right? At least for persistent caches, right? How do I differentiate? Right now, maybe it's because I'm an idiot and forget stuff, but this gives me to maintenance, which transitions the cache manager to maintenance mode, and allows me to do lifecycle stuff on the cache manager's persistent state. And it has destroy cache, which yes is useful and didn't ever exist before, but it doesn't really give me any useful way of either A, distinguishing between create that is supposed to open and create a POJO object that connects to a pre-existing cache, and create that's supposed to both do that and also create, or maybe optionally create, I don't know, the persistent cache.
Well, that's...
And because this thing is not really intended for persistent stuff, it has no distinction between cache configs for the POJO accessor and cache config for the persistent state.
That's the thinking, for me, to split the thing at the type system level, right?
Yes.
So you pass in the cache config that, at the minimal, reflects whatever is needed to have a non-eat cache. Right, yeah. Except
local is a terrible word, but you get my point.
And that possibly is flagged as using persistent data somewhere, right? Whatever that could mean. It could be on a cluster, like a location on disk. It could say how it needs to behave in case that data isn't there, right? So one way is to say, no, I don't think we're missing any methods, right? So
no, I'm not adding methods. Just.
And I never planned to support something that lets you do something. No. You don't. I wouldn't. So I can't.
I want to know what these do. What do people think these do?
Remove cache.
So that obviously presumably this is basically just destroying, if you like, the local accessor thing, right?
Yeah.
The transient. So it's destroying the transient view on whatever resources.
Not this.
Yeah, so don't remember that the persistent cache manager can contain non-persistent caches.
Yeah.
Right.
So the persistent can be between.
But there's nothing like a persistent cache, right?
No, because a cache is you need to view a cache as a window on a store, and so there are persistent stores. But the cache is just a window.
Persistent or not.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this one
at least creates the view, because there is nothing less that you can do, but you can carry over with that cache configuration that you pass along what is to be expected from the persistent aspect of it. And the way that I would have done this is not really through composition, but you got your cache config here. I'm not sure it is at all readable, and I lost the eraser. I have no idea where it is. But anyways, you got a cache config that possibly, like, I'm not sure what you could have. That to me is the questions that need answers, right? You could have something that flags it as persistent, just that, so it expects some data, right? That never really suffices because you need to know where the data is, right? So maybe a flag is sufficient in certain cases. Anyways, I won't go into details so much. But let me finish.
Yeah.
And then you sort of, if you want this to be created, you need to give it the information about what needs to be created. I would have attached that to the config here.
Okay, so you see this as a compound.
Right, but this is optional. You don't need to have the persistent bit of it in that. If you know it exists and you tell it where it exists, then you don't pass that in, right?
Right, but it seems weird that this thing is now describing not just the configuration of cache, but also semantics about the lifecycle transitions that this method will trigger. That seems that those are two separate things, and they should be separate parameters. The natural way to separate down the type system is that this does what it does, because this can have a consistent behavior, right? Well, I guess it's not a consistent behavior because
I'm not sure what you're saying. There are a bunch of ways of expressing this weirdo diagram I just made there at the type system. I think now you're arguing for different methods for creation.
I'm arguing yes. It seems more natural to me to have the different kinds of lifecycle transition that could occur on the two different entities be codified in different methods on persistent cache manager.
Right. I don't think so.
That doesn't preclude you having cache configuration be a compound, but it does open up the possibility of it not being a compound and you having type separation at this point. That it would be effectively you'd have public. That's terrible. Oh, shoot. Sorry, it's muting me when I type. The terrible method name I know, but you get my point. So we call this like the view config, and then
But I think that breaks the scale continuum, and that therefore I wouldn't do it that way.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. That breaks the scale continuum too. If you cease it to be a compound, I mean, there is no scale continuum in config, right?
I don't know if you say.
Well, I guess the other thing is basically what you can do is you can call this. You can say this one doesn't do that. This one creates a cache, right? Always creates a cache, and if you call this one, right, and it doesn't. And the cache that exists, it throws at you, right? And this one, and therefore what the persistent says is actually, we reword the definitions of the original cache manager methods to mean things that make sense for persistent too, and you introduce new methods that are weaker ones, things like view cache, which would, it's a terrible name, I know, but which has the semantic of will create a new view on an existing persistent cache, and if the persistent cache doesn't exist, throws.
So in the way that breaks to me the scale continuum is you will need to go through non-neglectable code changes and like all over your code base in order to make that work, and then you get into this whole, especially for clustered, where then it becomes like really complex, where all of a sudden there are two things happening. In the case of clustered, you need to cope with inter-client synchronization now. Yep. Well, you could provide methods for that at a cache manager level or at God knows what level. It's feasible, but that's added complexity that I'm not really sure why you would introduce and what it would buy. That's one. And then Crabo is the other one. The other one is that now all of a sudden it's a concern and that can't ever be externalized.
Right, but let me be clear. There's two kinds of scale continuum breaking here, right? To me, breaking the scale continuum on accessing a cache, on accessing this thing, that's bad. That's really bad. That's almost fatal, right? But breaking the scale continuum when you're interacting with the life cycle of these things, when you're moving from something with with one kind of life cycle to something with a very significantly more complicated life cycle with different transitions is not a bad thing. It is a reflection of reality. I think if you try and preserve the scale continuum when you move from unclustered to clustered or from non-persistent to persistent, you're hiding things from the user that are important. You shouldn't try and preserve the scale continuum at the expense of hiding new facets to the behavior. That's doing the user disservice. It is different. It needs to be shown to be different. But the point is, if you make sure those changes don't bleed into how it's accessed, then the only place it changes is where you'll find yourself bootstrapping and creating caches and stuff. And that's a well-constrained piece of code in any sensibly architected application. Right? Abalash is shaking his head, implying no, not right.
Yeah.
I understand what you're just saying, Chris.
I'll stop sharing now.
Didn't we have a mail on that topic on the mailing list, by the way?
From
my bad. No.
There was a mail thread on it. I don't know.
No. I thought it was about that, but it's.
Okay.
So it sounds like the problem's become even deeper, right? We've gone from how do you embed this in the config to what does the lifecycle look like to is the scale continuum, should the scale continuum should we attempt to preserve it? When we're talking about lifecycle of caches.
So what we did for the moment is for disk. So cache is having a disk tier. We have a persistent configuration. No, that's not the persistent configuration.
You want to share that?
I'm trying first to find the exact file. Started. Manager, persistent cache manager. Share. Two. So the way we do that for the moment is the persistence configuration exists at the cache manager level, and that's where the caches will source what's needed to back them up. So in the case of disk, obviously it will be files on disk. And the way we do the scale continuum is you just specify disk, and we just said that for the disk we can deduce that either it's persistent, meaning it should survive the end of the JVM, or it's not persistent. And we should do our best to make sure it does not survive the end of the JVM, and should it survive the end of the JVM because the JVM crashed and we could not clean up, then it's going to clean up when we restart the JVM. And so really what we're saying is the data that this cache contains has a life cycle which is limited to one execution of the JVM, or as a life cycle that's over JVM executions.
So what happens?
And I think it works in the context of disk persistence because we only have that side of the problem.
What happens if the end capacity doesn't match?
And that's
so if you ask for preservation, but when it comes back, it's saying a different capacity. And are there any other configuration properties that are tied to the persistent state, or could potentially be tied to the persistent state?
The way we do it for the moment is that, and I think it's also a consequence of the persistent cache on disk being simpler than clustered cache. The way we do it for the moment is, since you can only have a single view, you can't really create local cache multiple local cache that view the same data.
Right.
And so you don't have the conflict of the size. The
But
size
but there's still a conflict. What happens if I accidentally set it up with size 1?
too bad. It's going to start evicting as much as it can to get down to size 1.
Okay.
And the only thing that will be invalid is that if your size 1 is actually lower than the on-heap size, for example, because we try to prevent you from doing an inverted pyramid.
No, that seems wrong to me.
I'm not saying it's correct. I'm saying that's what we have today, and that's I'm using that as a way to illustrate the point you made about the scale continuum. And I think the reason why Abhilash started the way he started, because that's the logical. I mean, the logical stuff is to say, oh, I don't want disk, I want clustered. And since I don't want clustered, it means I don't have that kind of persistent configuration, but I potentially have with configuration whatever that needs. I don't know yet. If we split it that way, I understand that that clustered is a big problem. Because like Alex said, who the heck wins on the size? Who does create? Do you indicate that you're okay with having a cache that matches on the cluster in name, in ID, but doesn't match with regards to the settings you've specified? And let's use the size. And other questions. So and I understand that it's. So I'm wondering if the point Chris is making is not worth it.
Well, yeah. I think all the problems that you guys are mentioning can be solved with this approach. And what I like about this approach best is that you don't need to do a complete mental shift on day one when you move from one kind of topology to a persistent one. Again, whichever one it is. And that's what I like about this model. Now, if we really want to split them entirely, then I'm not really sure what it means, because what I fear is that it leads to two things. One is effectively is method explosions, right? Because you will need to have some kind of way to know and do certain things, like, is the data on disk? Okay, it's not there. Okay, I'm going to create the data structure. Again, the good news is when you do that and you're on your own, you can do this in quotes, racy way, because you're only racing against yourself. For as long as you make sure there's a single thread or whatnot, blah, 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 you're good. If you're in clustered, all of a sudden the world, like, things change, and you would need to do a bunch of different things. And that's what I don't like so much and would like to avoid. I would like the Ehcache clustered cache manager, effectively, be the one responsible for doing that, exactly in the same way that it is when two different threads on a given machine try to invoke create cache for a same cache with the same right? It's exactly the same, right? So we don't expose the locks, we don't expose none of that, right? We just make sure it happens properly, and in case it doesn't happen properly, we fail in a way that you understand what happened. So I think I personally still am in favor of keeping that paradigm. Okay. But I'm willing to buy the other argument, but in order to buy it completely, I would love to see why did that pop up? I'm being pinged like all over the place ever since this meeting has started. I'm not really sure why, but it's just the way it is. And now, like, random pop-ups open, but nobody says anything. Anyways, so what was I saying? I want to be sure to understand what it means for the end user and what it means in terms of scale continuum. Yes, when I move from on-heap to clustered, what will it mean? And right, that's what I have a hard time.
So can I try and understand? Make sure I understand exactly what the proposal is here, Louis. So I know we decided that for now, at least, a cache manager will be tied to connecting to a single TSA to drill down to specifics, right? For the moment. Yeah. At least on the surface, we knew that we would do it with services and stuff internally, so that in principle, You unmanaged, you could have multiple ones.
Yeah,
all
but
over the place.
on the surf. So no, think of it differently. A cache manager will need to connect to provide clustered caches. It will need to connect to something on the cluster, which
Right.
will the clustered store manager, to use very specific names. Because what the cluster needs to know about is the clustered store, nothing else. Since
Right.
the cache,
Oh, that's not true.
Well,
Okay.
Anyway. So you've got this with, so at the cache manager scope, you've got with cluster configuration, URI, blah, blah, blah. And that's really just saying stuff about how things connect, right? What's the with store doing? Just out of interest.
an idea to say, I'm configuring a store named something, and I'm actually configuring it here. And here I can specify a number of things, and the only way I connect, yeah, I should have.
Right, but shouldn't that be baked into the ID?
Yeah,
The alias, rather.
But maybe, I don't know.
Seems to me that the simple thing to do there is to say, in the managed sense, it's always going to use the alias. Anyway, so basically, that's kind of immaterial. The clustered, you've got the choice. You either say there's different variants of clustered depending on what you want to happen. If it's that I expect to connect to something that pre-exists, it will just be .clustered, no config. All right, assuming that it doesn't have to source the alias or whatever. Maybe with a string if it's going to connect, if you're going to do the naming of the thing it connects to that way. And then if it's connecting, and then maybe there's a parameter that says what happens when you shut down. Although that's weird because you have to coordinate things. And then there's the variant which takes then there will be a variant or a couple of variants probably that take configuration information that is destined to configure a potentially future clustered or persistent state. And those are going to be things that do override, create if it's not there, that kind of thing, right? Is that what we're driving at?
I don't know. So this is just this is just me trying to. It seems that when we discuss, we end up all going into different directions. And I hear Alex as an idea in his mind. I hear you pushing for potentially another direction, but nobody has ever tried to show what it looks like in principle. Abhilash proposed something, and we've pushed back. But the problem is, for the moment, what I hear is we push back in different direction. So what I'm trying to do is try to go with code and see, okay, so what about something like that, which would be...
Right, but so I think what you're trying to highlight there is exactly what I just put on the board, right? You need a way to tell that this persistent cache, right, is expected to use clustered resources, right? And what you did is move the definition of that clustered resource to the clustered configuration above. That is the service. So you tell the service, and then all of a sudden you can make this all like, kind of a put if absent or reuse whatever is there, and if it's there, you validate against the config that I just passed, or you ignore it, right? There's a bunch of modes that you can pass to the clustered configuration to make it behave different ways. How you make those two things match, right? You decide to go for an additional alias so that you can call them differently. Yeah, sure, why not? I don't really have an opinion. If it buys us something, why not? Sure, whatever. The important bit is that I'm more in favor of what Louis is exposing now, right? You tell the cache manager to what TSA it's connecting, right? Mm-hmm. And possibly you tell it how to behave in the face of certain situations, i.e. conflicting configs or whatnot. The way that I was thinking of doing this is the way that I sort of put it there was to have the you just tell that persistent cache is clustered, right? You could do this by passing an empty config, for instance, which says, all right, cool, whatever's on the server is what I'll take. If nothing is on the server, I'll just crash. Or you pass a very specific config, then if the thing is not there on the server, it creates it with whatever you passed in. And if it's not there, and if it is there, then again, maybe on the how you configured the client or whatnot. Whose concern that this is, I must say it's not entirely clear to me. But crap, was it? Right. And the reason why I would do it the way that I'm proposing is because there is a very tight correlation between the local stuff and the servers. So one example, for instance, being right behind, right? You need to express at one point that this thing is right behind, right? How do you best do this? I don't know, right? So now I'm picking the flaws in my ideas. To what extent I didn't push it to make sure that it actually works.
Mm-hmm.
So transaction is another one, but I think that one is actually kind of easy to solve. But the other one, well, right behind to me is somehow harder, right? Then you could solve it with the same way as what I'm thinking with the transactional stuff is whomever comes in first wins, even though I don't like that so much. But so that you can never connect. Though arguably, is this correct? Right? Should you be able to connect a clustered store, to reuse your wording, right? That was configured to be right behind. The important bit being that whatever makes it inside the cache, there also needs to be a matching operation that goes on the right behind queue for some people to consume further down the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is, as far as I'm concerned, why would it not be okay for certain systems to connect to the cache without having any right behind configuration?
But that will, if you're telling that on one client the cache is right behind, and on other client the cache cannot be a right behind.
No. The authority is right behind, but some of the clients don't process right behind items.
They don't right, so they don't come up with a writer. They don't come up with any right behind specific config, but it's not an issue, right? When you do a put, you also need to enqueue an operation that eventually will get consumed. I'm just saying that something somehow created that data structure from the clustering point of view, and also provides a functionality of what it means to do a put, a remove, right, and so forth, and a get, actually, even to that point. So
but Alex, I understand, but just to be clear, so we would be going for something like, so that's the clustered config, that's the cluster URI. I would do what on the resource pools level? So we keep that, we try to keep that concept, and then I potentially have a way of expressing any, and then a way of saying.
If my memory serves, the heap, disk, cluster, and whatnot that you're calling are just the aliases, right?
Yes, it's with resource, and then you pass a resource type, a size, a unit, and a persistent flag.
Right. So as such, that's kind of cool because you could have a resource pools builder that comes with like a clustered one or persistent one or a full-fledged one or whatever you want to call that.
So I'm going to assume for the moment that when we go to the clustered world, persistent is always true. That means when you lose the last view on the cluster, you don't wipe the data?
Well, I don't know, because Chris came up with an interesting use case I found in this previous long-winded explanation, which was the, kind of a callback for whenever the last node leaves. But then probably what you mean is leaves. Oh, that's the way I understood it, because I see you. Well, no, you didn't talk about a callback and so forth, but you said what should happen when everybody's gone or something. Now, maybe you would want to provide some kind of a clustered, non-persistent thing that comes up for the lifetime of a given set of L1s. But anyways.
So would we then be discussing potentially something like that? So here what I'm saying, and I'm using 3 different third.
Well,
so that's just an example. So this one, stop.
So that's totally not the way that I would do it.
Okay.
I would have a root thing that's a clustered config that represents everything that's about the config, the clustered aspect of it.
So-
Now you could make such shorthands and handy things so that somebody can quickly get it started on clustering. Though I don't think it would be a good idea, but anyways,
Okay,
you could do it. But effectively, what I would have is a thing that says, all right, this is maybe a persistent cache config. You could do it even at this type level, which extends cache config, but on top of that comes with the get persistent configuration. And the get persistence configuration, in case of clustered, represents everything that has to do with the clustered side of the world. Maybe I shouldn't collapse like clustered and persistent, even though I think they're...
Well, here's an interesting question.
So we would have clustered here, for example.
Well,
If
then I
I-
say my Lisp.
Can I ask a random question?
Well, if it would be random, I would say yes, but I'm sure it won't
What's
be
your favorite
random.
color?
Okay, that's pretty random.
No. I can ask a non-random question, but it's slightly askew of where we are right now. So, what are the interesting transitions for a cache user? So, we know that there's this. We know that the idea of create this cache if it doesn't already exist with this config, and if it does exist, well, okay. Okay. Let me go simpler. We know that there's one kind of startup that we think makes sense, which is please connect to this cache. I expect it already exists. I'm not going to provide you any config data, right? That we know is a useful transition. Or at least the ability to connect to an existing cache and ignore any config information is useful.
Yep. And
We
so
know that,
as simple as that.
yes, dot clustered. But this is clustered, I expect it to exist. And we know that
Okay, just to be clear.
So, and we know that there's probably a usefulness in. Oh, you're moving it outside of. Okay.
Yeah, no. So it's on the cache configuration builder. It's not on the
Okay, I
source
don't know.
tools or anything.
Whatever. And we know that, we know. That's not fair. I'm not going to say that. I suspect that there is some utility in connect to this cache, and if it's already there, just connect to it. And if it's not there, here's some config information to create it. Please create it and then connect to it. And my suspicion is there may be some value in please connect to this cluster cache. If it's not there, create it. Here's some config. If it is there, then validate in some way that might be dependent on the user and their application whether or not this config is compatible with the config that I think I want to have.
Mhm.
And there may be utility in please connect to this thing. If it's not there, create it with this. If it is there, destroy it and create it with this anyway. And there are probably more variants. And I want to figure out which ones of those are actually useful.
Destroying and creating again would be...
Override. I don't care what configuration it's got. It needs to have this configuration.
Yeah, but then in the clustered
Then-
world, who wins?
It
Dunno.
would destroy others. It might destroy entity which others are using, right?
Well, presumably it would fail if other people are using the
yeah,
entity.
I think if we do it that way, then the way it interacts with the lifecycle is if you connect, it doesn't match, you try to destroy, you get booted out because there are other clients connected, and then you
Then
get an exception telling
Yeah.
you, sorry, I can't do what you asked. If
Yeah.
there is no client connected, then you see it, doesn't match, you destroy, you recreate,
'Cause-
and potentially other clients can join.
Yeah, I mean, my suspicion is in a caching use case that there's probably a limited because the pattern we've tried to follow, right, with the cache manager is that with the cache manager and the managed caches is let's try and cover the 90% or more of users that do the simple shit. And if you want to do really weird, complex crap, then go unmanaged. So can we take the same tack here? Can we say, well, the simple stuff is like this particular set of compound lifecycle transitions, operations on combined states, and if you want to do anything more fancy than that, go unmanaged. Sorry, you're weird. You're in the 5% or the 1% or whatever. Does that
Okay,
make any sense? Or is it
One,
just totally unhelpful?
No. I think for me, what you expressed, I believe, relates to the possible compound operation you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah.
That you wanted to have the life cycle of the persistent data structure and the life cycle of the transient data structure, where transient means bound by the JVM's life cycle. And I think the interesting bit is on disk caches, we discovered that it's a Boolean in the end.
Right.
We had multiple states, but then we realized what you really want to express is when I restart my VM, should I reuse the cache data or not?
Right.
If I can. And in clustered, like you've said, we potentially have more axes because you're not the only one creating it. And so you may end up in the case where I want something, but there is actually something else already in place. And there you need to add behavior, which is what do I do? Strict, whatever, some level of strictness. And that's what I kind of try to highlight with these proposition. But again, I mean, not that I'm saying they hold. But so Alex, with what Chris said, you would do that then here inside. And so this
I don't think it has to be there. It can be inside the resource pool stuff if you want. Can't it? I mean, it is still an expression about resources.
It's one thing. The problem is that it's in.
Yes, it's other things too. I know.
It's other things too.
Yeah, and so
This is why I wonder if this is one of the things that splitting the config does it buy you? Not really, actually, because you still have the problem that things like right behind and stuff are still on.
But
well, they're still on there, like that, like how the
no, but that's
just like with strong consistency or eventual consistency.
But that's interesting. That's interesting. Anyway, today, the right behind configuration is splitted out.
No, wait.
Right.
Yeah. Wait, but wait. Don't mind what's there for multiple reasons. If only one of which were like, now, yeah, with TC5 and the work that's ongoing on how we're changing all this works. Anyways, don't.
No. But what I'm saying is, do we really want to have a single point where you configure everything clustered, server plus client? Or do we say we recognize that we have multiple PCs to the configuration? And so when you go clustered on the resources, and to that I assume server-side configuration.
Mm-hmm.
You go clustered on the connection, and that potentially warrants that bit. So here you would have this, because this is nothing with the resources. This is with how you interact. And if you have write behind, then write behind, potentially instead of passing a basic write behind configuration, we expect you to pass a clustered write behind configuration, which gives the extra parameters that are needed in this context.
Well, there are no extra terms in that context. That's the good news.
Okay.
Anyways,
You just some things become not optional, but
no, but so then in write behind, you've got the real scale continuum, and so we kind of try to keep the continuum in that context. So here, you do it that way then.
Why can't we have a Ehcache clustered setup tool, or setup API? We can.
No, wait, that's different, Abhilash. Nothing we say here prevents that. What we're saying here, and I think that's where Alex wants the scale continuum. What we're saying here is, I'm a happy Ehcache user. I've tried heap-only caches. Yeah, forget about that's the problem. I've tried heap-only caches, and I'm very happy with Ehcache. And now I want to try what happens if I cluster that cache and start deploying my application in 2 nodes. And so in order to do that, I do add the clustered config.
Yeah.
Let that one in. I do add the cluster config.
Mm-hmm.
I do indicate that I'm expecting the cluster size to be 200 gig. And for the rest, I'm happy with the defaults.
Right, and by the way, this
And
200
this-
gig there, this can totally set something on the clustered config that you passed above, and it doesn't, these are all shortcuts, right? So
Yep.
when you say heap, what it does is, I'm not sure what the real method is, but it takes a method that takes a couple of arguments, like setting what tier you're really talking about, right? That's what it is, right? Somebody help me here. Maybe I'm
It's
wrong.
that.
With
Right, see, resource type, blah, blah, and the unit and everything, right? So see, so this could totally be like clustered if you want, and how those two interact is this is all sugar. This is all synthetic, well, it's synthetic, exactly.
That's what it is for the moment.
All right.
This is synthetic sugar. Yeah, but it still is sugar
Syntactic.
over
Synthetic.
resources.
Right, right. So all of these like interact, right? You could, for instance, right?
So
Right. Anyways, what I was trying to say is that this cluster 200 gig is just an alias to me for calling the width, and the width itself is just how the clustered config and whatnot interact. I don't really care, right? It could
yes.
source it from the other one or the former from the latter,
Okay,
whichever
okay.
way works,
What-
right? But long story short, you end up with a clustered configuration that by itself, when it gets sent to the server, is incomplete. It's the one thing that tells you everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, sure. And we will aggregate, for example, the write behind config in there.
Well, the stuff that it could be right behind to me is a flag. It's on or off, right? And you could have, if you specify a write behind config in your cache config, then as such the cluster configuration says true for write behind automatically because it knows, right? It just makes sense as one. Like because false would be legal configuration thing, right? But the thing that you can do is pass no write behind config. On the clustered configuration, you say write behind true, and all of a sudden, you have a write behind queue clustered, and every time you do a put, there is a matching operation that goes inside that write behind queue.
Yep.
Now, how big like that is by default and whatnot, this all, these are things that can sort of delegate. It's a delegation model, effectively. That's what it is. But I still like this best. What we have there, right? So the clustered configuration that says to what do you say we connect, and then every cache config comes with a clustered cache config, right? How you make then all this syntactic sugar like work?
Okay.
That's all fun. It's all defaults, but it ends up with one type that says it all.
So it would be essentially
right. Again, there you can do a bunch of cluster cache config.
Config, eventual,
blah, blah, blah.
strict, which potentially means that if it is not 200 gig, it fails, or it can be.
Oh, right. Now you're going into details that I don't want to cover. I would have said that there are a bunch of ways of doing this. If you don't set the thing explicitly on the clustered cache config, it just means that it will go with the defaults. Like another way of doing it, when you say, oh, I don't care, you could have any there, clustered any or whatever, or server decides. Right? That's
this is what I propose here. That's what I wanted to express.
Yeah,
That's
but what I'm saying is any is like at the language level, it's a static instance of clustered configuration that I can identify. And I know it's, what he means is any, which could be the new clustered configuration, new clustered cache config empty itself. How you express that is not is whatever you guys like best. I'm still not sure whether I express my idea clearly, and whether we're even in agreement on it. What I see merging there seems to be like more and more closer to what I would do if I would be working on that now.
Okay, and so here, what it means is the way I view it is not the way I've heard it expressed. The way I view it is we try to stick with what we have conceptually already existing.
Well,
Meaning that
I don't know.
this is-
All
this is-
what you have there is exactly what I drew here, right? You got a cache config
Yeah,
where
nobody
possibly
sees.
off it hangs a clustered.
Alex, can you present to everyone? Because otherwise nobody sees your
Oh, okay.
diagram. It's gonna be only the small window.
Okay, so that's what I had here, right? You got a cache config. That's the minimal set in order to create a cache, right? And of that thing has a reference to clustered config, and that concerns only the local stuff, and that concerns only the clustered stuff.
No, so that I understand.
Right.
And
All the other stuff that you had there is just syntactic sugar in order to set one into the other like more naturally. But you can express everything just by sticking to those two paradigms.
Okay, so I agree with that. I agree with what you're saying. The only thing I disagree with is that it's just syntactic sugar. Because for me, that's where we potentially help the user do the scale continuum.
Okay, so
Right,
I'm not sure
right.
when you say that how this contradicts what I just said.
No, it doesn't.
Syntactic sugar is just about making the life of the user easier. But
No, yes,
conceptually, you got a
syntactic
clear
sugar is
split, and then what you add on top in order to make it easier swallowed by your customers,
Yes.
that's all fine with me. I don't want to make the life of the customer hell.
Syntactic sugar, to me, when people use that term, it denotes connotations of candy and things that aren't needed and things that don't like supplement your dietary requirements. That's not true of all forms of syntactic sugar. In this case, this form of syntactic sugar is actually vital to preserving, like you said, the scale continuum, to making it feel like a uniform experience.
Yeah, and so for example,
it's more like if I prepare you a nice meal of steak and asparagus and a baked potato, and then puree it and stick it in a bowl and say, here's your dinner. Functionally, it's the same stuff. It will still nourish you. It is not syntactic sugar to not puree it.
Right. No. Right. But so I'm not really sure again where this is all driving. What I'm trying to say is that it remains conceptually pure, and then we can like at the root, right? So there are those two very separate things, and how you make them build. Because by the way, there's been a slight confusion in the code that Louis wrote. He transparently switched from builders to configs. And they're two very different things. So I'm talking about the config levels, right? And then what you do with the builders so that how they interact is all power to the people.
Okay, so I think whatever I understood in this training, and
you know what? If you guys want the problem, hey, look at that. Monday is a holiday in the U.S.
France.
In France too, awesome. So in Belgium probably as well.
Yep.
All right. Everybody's picking his nose. So what I will be doing on Monday is I'll be doing a prototype of what I'm trying to argue for, like the full sort of blown thing. The builders. Hey, wait. Now I'm stepping back quickly. Did I not already commit to do something else on Monday because everybody was off?
Too late.
Right, that's public. It's live. It's out there. So what I could do is give a shot at doing exactly what I'm talking about, right? And I could mark maybe certain methods like as deprecated, not in the sense that I don't think that they're deprecated. I even think they're really. You want to do it. You want to make I wouldn't go that far in the kitchen analogy that Chris made. It's just you don't need to puree it, right? But how the thing gets served to you on a plate makes for a very different experience.
Yes.
And that's where I'm looking at. That's what I'm looking at. I want to make your experience complete. You should be very happy to eat the steak, and you're not eating it on the floor with your bare hands.
It's the whole thing that it's the whole thing. You eat the steak in a dingy restaurant, it doesn't taste very nice. If the lighting's nice and it's a clean tablecloth, then it's.
But I want the steak and the asparagus to be perfectly cooked.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So that's one thing. That still doesn't fully answer the question of the what, because here on your board you drew a single clustered config.
Right.
But we clearly also, and so that clustered config is really what concerns the cluster purely, for example.
Yeah.
The size of the storage you can use.
Right.
How do you represent, how do you view something like on this clustered store, the clustered cache, I don't want any client to be connected as eventual. I want all of them to be strongly consistent.
I had no clue this requirement existed, but I can give it some thoughts.
I'm using that one as an example. But
well, I can take the transaction stuff. If that's one that you want to use, then
let's
I don't
take another
know.
One, the right behind one.
Right behind one? Exactly as I said. On the cluster config.
I forbid clients from connecting if they're not ready to consume right behind events.
Well, again, then make it an enum instead of a boolean that is true or false, right? And again, I don't know. You're sort of making use cases up that I'm willing to incorporate, right? But those don't exist, right? So my question is, what are the specifications? Send me your specifications. And so one example would be exactly that. So this is right. Let me reshare it to everyone. How do I do this again? Here, present to everyone. I don't know where the eraser was, right? So you end up with a mix of things, right? So these are, in the previous presentation that I did, I represent those two things as documents, right? Well, sorry, this looks like crap. But effectively, for right behind, you need two things. You need the definition of the right behind stuff here. So that's the client, sorry. That's defined stuff as like, oh, there is interesting bits. Let's take one like the concurrency one. That's crap because that's one where like the scale continuum comes in weirdly. Let's use the exact example that you took, right? So we define this thing as the client needs to be right behind, whatever that means, right? So at least means it needs to have a certain amount of threads consuming stuff. So what does it mean for the server? Initially, I thought it was only a Boolean because the thing you cared about is whether it's right behind or not, i.e., create a queue and treat
and enqueue mutations.
Queue and store as one, right? So that's one thing. But now if you want to add me, so for specifying this, you only need a Boolean, right? If you want to tell me that what we want to propose to a user is I need 3 modes. I need the modes where it's, so that's 0 or 1, right? That's what this means. I need a mode where it's like nobody is right behind, so it's not right behind. I need a mode where it's right behind, treated like that. And then I need a third mode that says what I need is like all clients need to have this, right? There you go. It's an enum with 3 values. Problem solved. And what does it mean when you express something here to this config doc? You can infer stuff, right? So for instance, if the user had a right behind, again talking about the scale continuum, because this is where to me the syntactic sugar comes on top. The user had a right behind cache, right? I don't want him to set this explicitly to 1 if we decide that 1's the default, or maybe that 2 needs to be the default. I don't know, right? You can decide those things. Thoughts needs to be put into that, right? You don't need to set this on the server config, right? As soon as you add the clustered thing, it sees what is there and it can infer defaults for that automatically. So another one would be the transaction stuff, right? Obviously, the server needs to know that this is transactional or not, right? Good enough. This is, again, just a Boolean. That's all I need to know. Obviously, if this initial config didn't say it's transactional, then it's going to set this to 0 here, but then say this is something that we always validate, right? So this comes around to the server. Oh, the server has 1 here, so it rejects your connection. You're not, sorry, invalid, illegal argument exception or whatever eventually gets thrown, right? And I don't need the user to set anything on this particular config, right? It's fine. And this is why I said you could have something that says new clustered config.
And that's it.
That's it, right? By that you said that you want this new cache clustered config, or clustered cache config, whatever, or config clustered cache and shoes and toes and what other things, and neighbor. I'm referring to another earlier meeting, right? So whatever words you want to put together in order to define this class, what the semantic of that then is could be a bunch of things. And by the way, maybe some of that is then inferred by the client itself, how I'm connecting, right? Maybe this means that all of the client stuff all of a sudden has default, whatever those defaults are. They could be server inferred, right? Talking about the clustered tool thing that we talked about. When you ask me as a TSA to create the cache for you and you don't give me any sizing information, I'll decide that what you get is a cache created in, say, that clustered pool. That's there for that. Or there was an undefined. Okay, then it explodes. Sorry, this thing doesn't exist. There's nothing I can do for you. You can decouple a bunch of things by splitting very clearly those two things. And what I care about is really at the config level. So going back to the stuff that I mentioned, that this kind of dirty trick you played in your example stuff, Louis, is you intermingled builders and configs. So you started typing like clustered config, clustered, but you could, maybe we also accept like configs per se, but the builder is then the thing that creates this client config that has a reference to this server config, and we did say that we do preemptive copy anyways. So you can take this config and based on certain things, decide to merge it with something else or not. To me, it all works, and the builder can start doing those things, right? So if let's say we decide to add a .clustered method to the resource pools builder, which I wouldn't argue for, but let's say we decide to do it, it's fine. The fact that it eventually sets something on this config here, I have no problem with that, right? Don't get me wrong. That I don't care, but that's the important stuff.
Okay.
And so do you guys think it would be useful to do an exercise like I said, that I spend maybe a couple of hours on Monday, try to do something?
No, I think
at the moment all the work is on Abhilash's plate, so I'll let him answer that.
Sure, he won't mind.
Why would I mind?
I think yes, there's value. I will say that I don't want Abhilash to just take that.
I don't want any of you to just take that. I will not even share it or push it to my repo, maybe. I'll just show it on Hangout.
You're just going to do it, and then you're going to come and tell us that you did it and that it worked.
If you want, I can do something.
Yeah, exactly.
You can review.
No, but don't get me wrong. I know I have a strong idea ever since we walked into this meeting. This is why I was totally, and I was pulled into other stuff, but totally lost track of what was going on because this totally didn't go where I expected it to go. But this is because I had a very strong opinion. I didn't let my opinion go. I bought somewhat into Chris's, even though I don't like it because I think it makes the whole experience it's not. It's like, oh, you're going to dessert. Sorry, you need to stand up and go to the other table now.
Yeah. Here's the thing. I was not. You know what I'm like in most of these meetings. I'm not trying to argue for anything practical. I'm trying to reason about
And
some
everything you
bizarre
said,
abstract sense of right.
but I think everything you said is still correct fundamentally.
Yes.
So maybe the clustered cache managers, no, the Terracotta clustering service that gets injected inside the cache manager will let you do all those things. Well, most certainly will need to let you do all those things because it's going to be the thing that's so that maybe you can create a clustered store or a clustered cache or whatever through that directly remotely. But I don't see why I would be rubbing that onto the user's face, when he's doing like those sort of high level things rather, right?
Yeah, and so that's what I was saying at Avilash. So the fact that we discuss what it looks like from an Ehcache configuration builder / config creation API perspective does not exclude the fact that we end up having other services to potentially in a larger setup be able to decouple the creation of these clustered entities and let the caches just be declaring connection and nothing more. And potentially even having some of the local configuration be loaded through that. Because that's also something we discussed at one point.
Yeah, right. The thing that I just said, like, if you ask me to create something clustered and I don't know where to create it, right? Think of that, right? The pool example, the default pool example I just took is maybe a concept that we want to keep from the 2x line, right? In the 2x line, every cache manager comes with a pool that it has. You could do the same thing for clustered caches, right? You could say that, oh, my clustered config says that the default pool is foo and it's of size 200, and I didn't mention the unit. 200, and then you just you just say, I want this cache to be clustered. It's going to use fallback to this thing automatically. Maybe you don't need to provide it there. See, like, where exactly thing gets. I care mainly that we define the things where they belong, really. And this is at the config type level things. Okay. How we then make it work and make the pill like easily swallowed by people, I think that will even be a matter of taste, right? Should the napkins be blue or yellow? Well, I don't know. Well, I probably have a preference, but I certainly don't know.
Loud music.
Right, but for the config, I don't think that's a matter of preferences. It's modeling it sort of this way, and the stuff that I did now with the right behind, whether it's a Boolean, whether it's an enum, whether it's a whatever, I don't know, but these are, I think, the very interesting questions to answer. However, then we let the user then deal with those.
Yeah. Yep. So if I understand properly, fine. So what we are trying to do is that, however the builder or the user is trying to build the config, finally, we should have a clear distinction of a clustered config, which should over the wire travel to the over the wire travel to the server, and then server does stuff with that, right? That's what we want to achieve from this separation of concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also then on the runtime config, you end up doing get runtime config on the persistent cache, and maybe it returns you on a clustered cache. Let me use it that way because we keep on we're really around clustered here today. So maybe you do that, and on runtime config you say get runtime clustered config, right? And it exposes you the entire settings again. Like, this is my view of the world, right? Now, you didn't give me a right behind thing, but the stuff existed, and I'm allowing for people to connect without a right behind thread in the back that consumes stuff. But so you know now, everything you write to me will eventually be written somewhere by someone. Okay. So that's expected, and maybe there is a setter there so that I can change whatever should be changeable.
Yeah.
Through that.
Yeah,
so
now I understand what we want to do with the server side and client side config. Now I totally understand it. Maybe.
And these are the configs, not the builders. And
yeah.
It only came to me late that we sort of were.
So if we can have a builder, doing, mix and match stuff, which will be easier for user to understand. but eventually at the type system we should end up with a clustered config and the local config totally differently. Maybe
Right.
from the builder or user facing it looks mix and match, but at our level that should be different. That's what we want to
Right.
achieve.
And so at this stage, we end up with bunch of configs, by the way, right? We end up with a, possibly, not necessarily all of those types, but we end up with a clustered service config.
Mm-hmm.
We end up maybe with a cache manager, clustered cache manager config.
Yeah, and the
Maybe
clustered
there's
cache
two or
config.
maybe one, I'm not quite sure. And a clustered cache config, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what the properties of each of these should be, and how this maps to possibly already existing properties on the already existing configurations, like the cache configuration or the configuration, is also interesting. There is
Actually, I have
sometimes a mapping, sometimes not.
yeah. Actually, maybe the thing I shared did not convey that thing. Yeah, but that's what I right now. Whatever I tried for the hacking of things, that's what I did. I had a clustered cache config which had all those config, which is actually of a concern to the server. Which should actually travel to the server. Then I had a clustered cache config. I have it, and that clustered cache config and the service config, which is actually same, which I've kept same as of now, which has that TCURI kind of thing, which will go and connect to the cluster tool to figure out the whole server topology and whatnot. And yeah, so that has been the, then I think, what I have that code with me, maybe I can share with you, but I would like to see what Alex wants to do.
Sure, I can probably in a couple of hours I can write something with the builders, a couple of options like how I see the possible, like with the sizing, for instance. To me, I see this stacked, right? So to me, the example we started from, the clustered, is sort of the very extreme, because clustered falls back into with resource type clustered, which itself goes back into, in my books, back to the clustered config of that cache, right?
Yeah.
That is that one line that was there, and that all of a sudden was a config, even though we were setting it on the builder. And again, the fact that we do this isn't at the type system at a runtime system, the runtime from a runtime perspective isn't a problem from neither perspective, right? Because you could say, all right, it's the default, it's a runtime thing, so anyways, we copy it. It's being copied. The fact that it's being enhanced by other things that you provided. That's me perfectly fine. And then there possibly it calls back into the cache manager class config where it goes, oh, I'm supposed to handle defaults that way or this way or right. What?
Yeah.
That could be too. But yeah, I could try to do this for a couple of things. I think that transactional is possibly interesting. I think that right behind is possibly interesting, and then the sizing. I will not go into ARC because sadly enough we're not there yet. But it really feels like this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem by every week. That ARC isn't fleshing out. Oh well, what can you do? If we do something wrong, well, right? Exactly. Do it next week. Do it tomorrow. That's what I keep on telling myself.
No, Alex, do it on Monday while we're all out.
Exactly. I'll give it a try. I'll make something. I'll post it to the mailing list. Push it obviously to my repo or something. Or maybe I'll just share code snippets so that it's not even there. And
Yep.
I'll do the full-blown thing because it's much easier, I find, in the IDE to just use it for what it's for. But
and if you want to have a look what I have done, then maybe we can extend this meeting after the live.
I think we'll have to call this done. But
yeah,
what we can do,
half hour over.
Well, we can, right. We started slightly late. What we can do, Abhilash, though, is this won't be able to wait until next week. But maybe we can meet again on Tuesday. Would that be possible? And I know you're traveling, so.
Actually,
when do you?
Yeah, so next week till Thursday I'm on vacation.
Till Thursday. Thursday inclusive?
Yeah.
Whoa.
But I can attend a meeting, not a big
Who
deal.
Who
approved
said
that?
yes to that?
Well, yeah, we'll prove that.
Are you
Okay.
staying in the US for your vacation, or
Oh, you don't need to answer this here.
who knows to answer that?
You don't
Wait
need
till
to
we're
answer
not
that at
live,
all,
and
Milo.
then
Yeah. So we'll see how to keep on going with that. But what I'll do is I'll put something together, share it on the mailing list on Monday, and then we can try to digest this somehow, each on our own somewhere,
Sure.
and then take it from there. Yeah, honestly, if nobody's making progress on that, then it can totally wait until next week, right? It's perfectly fine. There is. I just said I would like to see ARC emerging because this has some direct impact into all of this. I don't think it's a problem, but I don't really know how we plan on making ARC work in the end. I have ideas again, but they're only my ideas. And I'm not a smart guy, really. So it says. All right, cool. Well, that made my head spin.
Yes, same here. But it was interesting.
Yeah.
See you guys.
cool. That's it.